Welcome to another Tech Stuff Tuesday. This week I'm going to be rebuilding this sub. Now there were two of these made. This is not a production motor from that manufacturer, but this customer got two of these and got them for an SPL purpose, and they did not do so well. From what I understand, he requested they do certain things and not do certain things, and that wasn't exactly adhered to, and the ideas that he had would have been better for the purpose than they, I guess, took on their own liberty to build. So the reason I'm showing this to you with it together is so I can show you what it is and what I'm doing instead. So like I said, this motor, there's only two of them made. I don't know how much of this is normal for their production, but from the request of the customer, I asked that I be very careful because this can scratch easily and seemed kind of odd to begin with, but now I see it's kind of just a dusting of black paint. So at some point in this video, you'll see this entire motor get covered up because I have to treat it like a dainty flower to ensure that we don't get any more scratches. There were some scratches before that have been touched up, that kind of thing. So that's step number one, is be particularly careful with these. Now, what else is changing? This basket does work well for SPL, and we are going to continue using it. However, there is a caveat. I have to use a brand new basket for a few different reasons, but one of those reasons is this ring. This ring that you see in here, it's cutting off a lot of the spider. So this is an 8 3/8 spider, or at least the landing is, and this is getting cut down to just under 7 inches. So we've only got 3 rolls of spider on here. We're actually going to be utilizing all of the spider. We're pretty limited here. The terminals have bolts that go through, and these are just ring terminals that are crimped onto tinsel leads. So we're getting rid of those. I don't like doing direct connects, but the customer specifically requested that, so I am doing that. We're going to get rid of these bolts and ring terminals and that kind of stuff. We're going to go directly to the leads that will go above here, not through here, and I'll show you exactly what happened there. So the spiders, what we're changing is we have got 4 pretty stiff spiders on here, and when you go down, basically cut them down to 7 inch, we don't have an enormous amount of throw. They're pretty stiff. We're limiting the rolls, so this is actually a very, very stiff setup, and the leads come through the spiders. So the problem that happens here is sometimes you might be clipping it because you have a really cheap Class D amp that's really dirty, or maybe you're just driving any amp, even a good amp, into clipping, and what happens is these leads get hot, and when they get hot, they get fragile, and they fray, they burn, and they're sandwiched between these two leads, or these two spiders, and then you get sparks, because when you take power and you put it through a wire that can't handle it and it arcs, so then you have sparks between the spiders. Then your spiders catch fire, and that's how your sub catches fire. So we're going to make sure these subs do not catch fire by not doing leads like that. We're going to do it how I normally do. Something else you might notice, these joints are kind of sloppy. This whole joint is really pretty sloppy, and the dust cap on this one, this whole outer edge, I've seen them do that a lot, is also very sloppy. That's not something that I would send out the door myself. I'm sure it holds perfectly fine, but it's not something that I would send out the door. I don't feel confident. It just shows shoddy craftsmanship. On this one, the dust cap isn't so bad, but I've seen other subs from the same manufacturer that are done the same way, some of which you'll actually see in a future video here soon. So the cone is very lightweight, and it is pretty strong, and that's very good. This surround is not too terribly stiff, somewhat limited on throw, and X-Max is not everything to do with SPL, but this cone itself doesn't look too bad other than being limited, which is fine because the spiders are so limited. Now, another thing with the basket change that I mentioned before is these bolts right here. We've got bolts coming up through, we've got nuts, we've got washers. And because of how this basket is, this has actually been machined out on the basket, pulled back so it will fit around these washers. I don't like modifying baskets in that fashion, especially around mounting points. That does not make it any stronger. It in fact makes it weaker. Unfortunately, that is something that has to be done because with other baskets we don't even have the opportunity to be able to cut this out for various reasons, like it would go directly into a spoke, that kind of thing. So we are kind of stuck using this basket and modifying it. However, what I'm going to do is the minimum that we need for clearance, put a washer under that so we don't have to go quite as far. I'll just be lifted up just a little bit and just enough to go around the nut, not all the way around the washer, so we can do less machining on this one. So that I will do off camera because it's kind of boring, and I will show you the end result of that. So what are we changing on this? Everything. We're changing the coil. This has got larger than normal gaps in it, particularly the pole is narrower than would normally be there, and the ideal coil that I would use in this sub is not something that is readily available. I would have to have it made, which means an entire run of coils to build 2 subs, and that's not practical. It'd be very, very expensive to do that. So I've got the next best thing that we'll be using. Most of the improvements that we'll be having here are going to be in the suspension. The coil should work out a little bit better. Suspension should work a lot better. The cone that we're using is still going to be pretty good for this application. It does weigh a little bit more than this, but it is very rigid and will not have a problem with it. I use it on YOLOs all the time, including over 180 dB. So it's a cone that I know is going to work in the enclosure that he's got that is very small, regardless of how much power ends up getting put on these subs. So now we've covered all this stuff that is getting upgraded. I'm going to tear it down, mill out the basket, and then we'll start the actual rebuild complete process. Now, just a few minutes in, I'm going to predict the comments. Somebody is going to say that I have these to steal the design or study the design. The design is bad. That was explained in another video. I want nothing to do with that. There's also going to be complaints that I'm just talking smack. I haven't mentioned who made this, so you're pitting that on yourself if you're already making accusations. Now, I know something that's going to get asked is how strong is this motor? Because it's supposed to be super strong. I won't use the word that they call it. So if you look right down here, we've got a Gauss meter. Now, for perspective comparison, a EMF YOLO V1 comes in around 9,400, 9,600, some meters might show 10,000. This one, the gap is down here, mind you, not up here. As you can kind of tell, it's pretty weak down there. But we get down here, and we're showing a little over 8,000, right around 8,000. We do not have peak hold on this. So we're showing right around 8,000 on this one. So we've got over 10% weaker than a YOLO V1, and a YOLO V2 is actually 20% stronger than a YOLO V1. 30% stronger than this. Alright, I have taken the old basket off. I've gotten a new basket. I've machined it out by hand, and I'm sure you're wondering what I did that with. Rotary tool and this bit. Grinds out aluminum pretty well. Did that completely by hand to make clearance for these nuts that go through here. And just had to bring them out about a 1/16 of an inch or so, maybe a little bit more for clearance. They're not perfectly centered, as you can kind of tell. That's not the way that I cut it. That's the way that these are. All of these are not actually perfectly straight with the pattern, so they're a little bit awkward shaped. But you might notice that I have M6 hex bolts in here now, and this is what was in there. Phillips head. These are metric. These are M6x1, but they have the Phillips head, and I hate using these. I want something I can get much better torque on. Those are in there with a little bit of thread locker. No lock washers or anything. I prefer lock washers, and I use an impact to put them in, and they don't come out. Hundreds of subs that way, it's still fine. So this basket is already prepped in that I have taken sandpaper and gone around the outside edge here and on the spider landing and scuffed that up so we don't have a perfectly flat surface, so we have a good bonding surface. It does not have to go down to the metal. What I've done right here is perfectly fine. Again, hundreds and hundreds of subs, no issues that way. Can you do this with the basket on the motor? Yes, you can. Some criticize that you get dust and dirt and grime and everything in the gap, and that's not the case because we're scuffing, not sanding. And if you get a little bit of dust in the gap, it doesn't matter. We're not in a clean room environment. In any motor, particularly this one, it can also vent out here, but also if you had a vented pull plate, you could suck in dust from inside your box after the fact, and I've seen that happen before. So no, you do not have to have it perfect, spotless, clean, but you do not want to have a ferrous metal in that gap. So this basket is aluminum. Even if you did get a little bit of aluminum in there, it's fine. It's not going to stick. It's going to fall right through. You can blow it out, whatever. If it were steel, it could get in there. That you don't want to have happen. It is conductive. It can cause all kinds of problems. It will actually stick in the gap. So steel, bad. Aluminum, fine. Dust, fine. Sawdust, fine. When you go to actually glue this down, we'll make sure this is cleaned up. So not a big deal for right now either. So now we can move onto the other parts. All right, the critical components that we've got here, we've got the voice coil. Now this has a super long former on it because again, our top plate is actually down here. This is just for mounting. This is what would be the top plate, which would normally be up here. So we have a lot of limitations, as I was mentioning earlier, particularly with the former length. This is one coil that I did find that is pretty close on dimensions to where I ideally wanted it, but the biggest thing is going to be the former is long enough to get all the way down there. So the center of this coil has got to be at the center of this right here, and this is actually 2 layers. It's 1 inch thick. So we have to mark this, which I've already done. I don't think you can see it on camera, but the center of this, to make that there, we just go to the top here because we can see a gap right in there, so we know where to line this up. So I've got my mark. We need to place that mark right where you can see it on the top of that top plate, and we're going to do that after we put the spider on. Now this spider is going to work out great for SPL. It's what I use on a lot of YOLOs. It is a 3-layer pack, and you notice the leads are on top. So if you have a problem, you can see you have a problem, but also they don't spark and catch fire. So we will have to put the coil through the hole, but that doesn't always go straight on, which this one will not. So what do? We've got a rasp on a drill. So I'm gonna get this cleared out just to free it up, loosen up a little bit, slide that over here, and then we can slide the coil in place and start to get everything lined up. Now with this, so we have just a little bit of slack, we can actually move this around just a little bit, but it's still nice and firm. We've got a triple joint ring that is on here as well. That will get glued in after the fact. Now I know that this spider is not going to go all the way down here. But I want the basket to push it up to make sure that everything is lined up as far as possible. So we've got our shims. You can just use printer paper. If you happen to have something that you printed out you don't need anymore, hang on to that paper. You can repurpose it for this. So that's what I do. I already know how many I've got in here, and the idea is to have the shims to where you can slide the coil on there. You can move it easily, but there's still resistance, so it'll actually stay in place. You don't want it too tight to where you're fighting it. You don't want it too loose to where it moves around. So make sure you know where your mark is. Mine happens to be right there. You don't want the leads to fall under there either. You might have to pick up the paper a little bit, slide it in. So now we just keep moving it down until our mark will show up right down there. And I've got it in view. And there it's lined up. So now we've got the proper alignment. Everything's in place, but it's not just going to stay there on its own. So we're going to put a small amount of glue right around the edge, just enough to hold it in place. It has been asked before what glue I use. This is a rubberized CA glue. You can get it in different viscosities. This is a little bit thicker, but I also tend to use it cold, so it thickens up just a little bit as well. But we're just going to go right on this edge, just enough to hold it in place. And on the case of this cone, is actually going to sit just a hair above that joint, so it's not as critical that we have it as thin. But if you do have a cone that goes all the way down, if you put the glue too high or too much, anything like that, when you go to slide the cone on, it won't go quite all the way down. But we don't have to worry about that on this one. And other question I've gotten before is, what is this that I'm spraying on it? This is accelerator. This, I don't say instantly hardens it, but it somewhat does. Makes it so you can then work with it a little bit. It does not fully cure for 24 hours still, but it does make it so you can continue to actually work with what you're dealing with. So now with this glued in place, we have to get the cone on. So I'm going to take these leads and just actually tuck them right over the edge of the former. And the reason I'm doing that is that will make it easier to get the cone on, and that will actually slide right over those leads. Alright, now with those folded over, we've got our cone. Now, going to be the same deal on this. This cone might not slide perfectly over that to where you have to bore it out just a little bit. And for that, you can use a screwdriver and just kind of go around this edge. So apply some pressure while you're coming out here, and that will just flatten this out just a little bit, and that might be all the clearance that you need to get this through. So we're going to test fit this. And that is not going to do it. So I'm going to work on this just a little bit more until it will go on. I've bored out the cone just a little bit more, and it slid right on. So things that you need to remember when you're doing that. You have your leads off the coil and the spider, and you want to make sure that those are lined up when you're getting the spider on there, but also making sure that everything's lined up and they haven't crossed paths or anything when you're pushing the cone back on. If you have the little holes cut out, notches for the basket and the surround, you'll want to line those up as well, and make sure that while you're doing that, that your leads are lined up where your binding posts, or in this case where the direct leads will come out and they'll be secured where the binding posts would normally go. So leads come out here in the correct spot. This is lined in the correct spot. It's pushed down to the point where the top landing, we're not forcing it upward, there's not a gap downwards, even though there is a bit of a gap down here as I expected. So the next thing to look at is we pulled the leads back up through here, but we don't want to make sure that we're not too far because we don't want to pull all the slack because there is that gap there. So I'm going to use the pick tool to kind of manipulate these leads a little bit and make sure that we have the correct amount of slack and they're laying down properly. We want to make sure that the leads lay flat against that former and there is not a gap, because once you get it in motion, even though it's under the glue here, it is possible that this could pull from here and then break the lead right there. So we don't want to have a gap. So we're just going to pull those back, make sure they're flat all the way. And now we can solder the leads from the spiders to the leads on the coil. You might also notice that I protected our dainty little flower from this point forward, as we no longer have to see what is happening in the gap there. Now what you can't exactly see, and I could probably change the camera angle here, but I have wrapped around the coil lead, just wrapped it around the tinsel lead. So where the tinsel lead comes out this way, the wire just goes right around it that way, and then you can solder it, makes it nice and easy. Now that everything's soldered up, I've trimmed off the very end, so we're only dealing with what actually has solder on it. And now we're to the point where we can put a glue joint on the top. Now the key thing with boring out the cone here is you want to make sure that it's not too much, because when you go to put glue on top, it's just going to go straight through. So you want a very snug fit for this purpose. Now a notable thing, you want to make sure that your leads are glued down. You want to make sure that these, where you soldered them on, cannot be flying around anywhere. So if they're completely submerged in glue, that's great. If they're not, and you still have a joint under it and then they're still tied down, that's good too. But the biggest thing is make sure that those cannot move around at all. Not just kind of a little bit of glue, like a fair amount of glue on them. So from here, we can now do one of two things, depending on the order you want to do them. We need to do this joint, and we need to do this joint. This one is where I'm going to start, and I like to go from the cone itself, hold it at a slight angle, let it kind of bleed down, and work it in sections. And just like that, we've got a nice, clean, good glue joint that goes completely over the former, so that is now strong. It doesn't look awful like when there's a gap that a certain manufacturer likes to just kind of glue at the top and not the bottom, which is weak anyway. So we've got a strong glue joint on the cone, at the spider, and that entire piece. So we're going to do that same thing all the way around. And there we have it, glued all the way around. Nice clean joint, no machines, no jigs, just a steady hand and a bottle of glue. We've got the top of the cone. We've got the bottom of the cone, also known as the triple joint. Now we've got to do the bottom of the spider and the triple joint ring. Does every sub have a triple joint ring? No. But ours do, and some others do. So what helps is if you got a lazy Susan like we do, you can just spin it around as you apply the glue. Make sure you've got enough so when you set this on, it should squeeze out just a little bit, so we know this will be connected to everything, which is what's giving us the strength. And then we're going to go back and we're not just going to put the glue on there, we're going to spread it out. That's actually a little bit less glue that I would like to see on it, so I am going to go with a little bit more right behind it. I've got a nice even spread of glue that goes completely across the top, the bottom, and the joint piece itself. If you've kept up so far, consider subscribing and also checking out emfcaraudio.com for all of your car audio purchases. And another question I thought of that I'm going to run into here, two of them actually. One, can I rebuild your fill in the blank? Maybe. If you brought it to us and dropped it off, yes. Can I just build a drop-in like this and send it to you? No. The only way I can do that is if I have the motor and basket that would be built on. That's the only proper way to do it. And no, I can't do that unless it's an EMF branded product where I have that stuff, or in some cases it might be a random something that I'm already doing for somebody else that I might have another one. But in other cases, no, I cannot just do that. By the time you ship it to us and I ship it back to you, is it going to be worth it? Who knows? In this case, it was worth it to them. And the reason being is they contacted the manufacturer after it did not do so hot, and they told him, you should find somebody else to build it. When the manufacturer tells you you should find somebody else to build it better, you come to somebody who can build it better, and that would be me. So we're on to the direct leads. And the way that I do this might be different than the way that somebody else does it. And if you do it a different way, cool story, bro. So the left lead is always going to be your positive. We're using silver for positive. And we've got to make sure that we're off the landing. You know, we don't want to have it right here. So the basket's going to be about right here, and that's about where it's going to be secured. So we're going to have the leads over here. And what I do is I have a stash of coil lead that I've cut off of different things, and I like to wrap it around before I solder it. So that is going to hold that in place. I will do the same on the negative, making sure that they are the same distance from the splitter along the length of the lead there, because anything else might not mount up correctly, and it's just a little sloppy to be inconsistent with that. So now we have these tied on, we can solder these. And we're going to want to solder the very end of this. Now, can we go all the way through it? No, not without applying a torch and basically destroying the entire thing. So we're going to get as much coverage as we can, starting with the end of the wire, and make sure that's absorbing in, and then we will work our way down. Let gravity do its thing, and at some point you're not going to get this wire hot enough. You might have to let it sit there for a little bit. You may have to move it around, but we want to get on top of the lead where we wrapped it around. It's going to be an extra contact point. So we're going to go all the way around these leads and make sure we've got solder all the way around, then clip the excess off and apply heat shrink. Now with one side done, we're going to do the other side and take this time going in fast forward to go ahead and post your complaints that you probably already have. Now for the glue. We're going to make sure that we've got our direct leads coming through right here where they're going to get secured. Ideally, we don't want to have to try to shift it around after it's in there. We're going to use our CA glue on the spider landing and black E6000 on the surround. We're going to start from the bottom so we don't end up getting glue on us while we're doing this joint. In some cases, you could do the surround after the fact. If you can spin it up and hold it up kind of easily. This is not one of those surrounds, so we're gonna put the glue on ahead of time. So we're going to let this sit. You can put accelerator around the outside edge if you've got some curling up, but I am actually going to put a pool on top of it just for extra measure, so it'll be glued from the bottom and the top and kind of the side area. But here is the part where we want to make sure that we get the surround on here well enough, and you make fun of me for using all of these clamps. So here's where the other comments come in of, why don't you just use different glue that doesn't require that you secure it? Technically, this doesn't. You can sit it on it. It will adhere. It could be perfectly fine. But this is an SPL build. And I build everything like I'm building it for an SPL build, even when it's not. So I put pressure on it to ensure we have the perfect bond that will absolutely never come loose. So why don't I make a ring that goes on it? Because I don't really care. This is fine. It works fine. It's what I've done. It works. When you're using different baskets and different cones for different things, it wouldn't make sense to even make one for that. So this is what we're using. This is going to sit for some time. So while this is drying, we're going to get our puddle of glue, so to speak, on top of the spiders. Now with glue on the top of the spider, everything else good except the dust cap. That's coming up. We can go ahead and secure our direct leads. Now the binding post would go up through one hole in the basket. And I'm just running the wire tie up through that hole, over the wire, and back through the same hole. And then we will secure it. And clip the end. If you don't clip the ends of these things off, you should die in a fire. Everything's secure here. We are going to wait until all of this is dry before we put the dust cap on, because we want to make sure that there's no chance that that is going to move around. So this should be dry in about an hour and a half. Then we can put the dust cap on. Now with the glue dry for this round, the only thing we have left is the dust cap. And this is what we're using. It's a plastic dust cap, EMF logo printed on it. Makes sense, that's what we do. And because this is EMF-ish, I will handwrite the ish in there as I do on such things. So one consideration to kind of keep in mind, if you do have a logo on your dust cap, you want to make sure that it's going to be facing the direction that you want it to. So we've got mounting points here and here, and there's special request that the wires come out the top and bottom, so that's what we're doing. And our dust cap is going to sit like so. So our logo goes across here, and it's going to be lined up accordingly to the screw-in mount points. I have seen it where people just kind of throw them on there, don't think about that, and then it's in a weird position. So if you're trying to, make that any specific way or make it look as best as possible, as clean as possible, take that into consideration. For this, we are going to be using E6000. We're just going to put it right on the dust cap on the inside edge. And this cone does not have a ridge for it. So you kind of have to ballpark it in the middle. I've done this so many times, I can get it pretty well spot on, and then I just go back and check it with a tape measure. It does help if you're right over it, standing to where you can look directly down on it. The way that I'm doing this is a little bit harder for the video. I'm putting the glue on the inside edge because it will spread out to the outside after it has been applied. So I'm going to make sure that we've got this twisted just right. I'm going to put weight on it to make sure we've got a good bond and it stays in place. And on a dust cap, you definitely want to have weight on it to make sure you get the best bond possible. If you don't, there's a possibility that it may not stay on there so well. And verifying all of these measurements, I've basically got it within about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch of being perfect from when I just sat it on there. So now we wait for the dust cap to dry. We can connect this up, make sure everything plays fine, basically bench testing that, and we're good to go. And here we've got the final product, dust cap on. It's EMF-ish, and I'm going to run it through quick paces on the test bench to make sure that everything is okay. There's no rubbing, no scraping, no odd issues that might happen from here. Now, something to note about this and what we may hear on the bench that's normal versus not normal is sometimes you'll get subs where the spiders are noisy. That actually is a mechanical distortion. These spiders are a little bit noisier than others, but they work well for SPL, so we deal with it. They're not quite as good from the daily side, but they're not bad as long as you don't have it inverted. Now, this sub does not have a pole vent, so we don't have to elevate it, give clearance for any of that. But that also being said, because it does not have a pole vent, all of our venting for the coil is down here. There's on either side of these shorting rings, there's a small gap. And that's the only place that air can escape from down here. And then the spiders will move and push air out of the basket here as well. So we've got the plate, the mounting plate up here with a small gap, the small air gaps in the basket, and then down here. And all of those are going to be our air exchange. That being said, when you take a volume of air and you put it through a small gap, you get noise. You get mechanical chafing noises. So all the air that's coming from the dust cap down between the pole and the former, that's going to be some noise. And then these other plates right here, all that's going to generate noise. That's some mechanical distortion that you're going to hear. If you had it inverted, it might be pretty bad. But in the enclosure, may not be too bad. You might hear some of it in a ported enclosure. But we're going to ramp this up. We're going to go to pretty close to full throw. Let's make sure we don't hear anything that we shouldn't be hearing. And we're probably going to hear some mechanical noise, which is completely normal for this. So run it through one complete cycle. There's a little bit of popping from glue that can occur if it's right on the edge of the roll of the surround back here, which we're using a flexible glue, so that's not the case, but that can happen if you're using a CA glue. Or on the spider itself, you might hear it from one of the rolls here. Just a couple cracks, pops, not a big deal. Very common. It stops after you break that loose just a little bit. So this tests out perfectly fine. We're good to go. I'm going to continue to break this in for some time because the customer requested that they get some specs on it to have on hand. So I'll continue doing that while we wrap up this video. Make sure you shop emfcaraudio.com to support the channel and the store. And you can pick up everything from Sundown Audio, EMF Audio, SBC, Audio Control, and Excess Power right there 24/7 on the website. Currently, only for a few more days, we have got a sale on tax time stuff. A bunch of subs from Sundown Audio, up to 15% off. Our swag 6.5s, America 12K, all on emfcaraudio.com. We also got some sound deadener on there as well. You probably want to pick some of that up. You can support our channel on Patreon. That link is below, right next to the links for Instagram and Facebook as well, so you can keep up so you can see when things like this are coming up. I post behind the scenes pictures and sales and that kind of thing, so you can keep up with that. And make sure, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you get notifications for every Tech Stuff Tuesday video and all the other random uploads that we might have. And I will see you again on another Tech Stuff Tuesday.